One of the most exciting times to be a gamer is whenever a new console comes out, which is usually about every 5 to 6 years. It gives PC gamers a chance to tell everyone how big their winkies are, and console gamers obviously love the upgraded hardware. A lot of parents used to call this a scam, which is a reasonable conclusion to jump to if you don't know a thing about video games. But for everybody else who could tell the difference between these two pictures, it was totally worth forking a few $100 over, or combining your birthday and Christmas wishes to get the upgrade. However, when you take a look at the 8th console generation, which is the one we're currently in right now with the PS4 and Xbox One, I think it's pretty clear that these are the most pointless upgrades of them all. Why is that, you ask? Well, pour yourself a glass of unfiltered water, clap your cheeks together as hard as you can, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, CameronAllOneWord, to tell you why. Okay, so when I say this console generation was the most pointless one yet, I'm not saying that it was bad. In fact, if you watch my console tier video, then you'd know that it's probably my favorite generation ever. But that opinion's based on the software far more than the actual hardware, and for the most part, I don't think we needed brand new consoles at all to get the kind of games that we did. If there's even one PS4 or Xbox One game that'd be impossible to put on the PS3 or Xbox 360, then let me know in the comments, but I honestly couldn't think of any. I know most of the games that were specifically dedicated to 8th gen hardware probably wouldn't have looked as good or ran as smoothly, but I don't think that any of the core games would have actually been worse if you cut a couple graphical corners. The Nintendo Switch is more powerful than the PS3 and Xbox 360 according to all this mumbo jumbo. But unless you're some kind of boy genius or something, I don't think you could actually tell by comparing how the games actually look. So if that's the case, then it's pretty hard to argue that there's any 8th gen games that'd be impossible to make work on the 7th gen hardware. I mean, just look at the Nintendo Switch version of Doom. It doesn't look as good or run as smoothly as other versions, and if you don't care about portability, then it's definitely not worth the extra money. But the actual core game itself's completely intact, and not to the point where it's a demake like Tony Hawk 3 on the PS1 or anything like that. The impact in the 8th generation just wasn't the same as going from the NES to the Super Nintendo where 2D gaming was pretty much perfected, or going from that to the dawn of 3D gaming, then to the era where developers had a much better idea of what they were doing with those kinds of games in the 6th generation. The 7th generation saw a pretty big graphical leap and it greatly improved online multiplayer, or at least Sony and Microsoft did anyway. But even the Wii was still way different from the generation before it, and whether you liked it or not, you definitely couldn't call it pointless. You could disagree with the purpose of motion controls, but there was definitely a point to them. Although, come to think of it, the Wii Remote was originally in development as an add-on to the GameCube, so maybe it was kinda pointless. But whatever, I don't think it was pointless, and the 7th generation as a whole was still a huge leap in quality. If you tried to put Metal Gear Solid 4 on the PS2, it just wouldn't have been the same thing at all. And the same could be said about putting Pikmin on the 64 since 100 separate AIs couldn't have been processed at the same time, nor could Mario 64 have worked on the Super Nintendo. A lot of Super Nintendo games can and did work on the NES, but even then, the core games not only looked noticeably better on the SNES, but most of them actually were better. Besides, the NES wasn't going to play a game like Star Fox or anything like that, so it's not like the upgrade was pointless. Meanwhile, games that were released in the 7th and 8th generation simultaneously, like Persona 5, looked exactly the same on both platforms. I mean, a lot of people didn't even know that, nor did anybody think the game looked bad on the PS4. In fact, most would agree that the game was visually impressive, but little did they know it was actually a PS3 title. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should still be waiting for the PS4 in 2020 or anything like that. I'm just saying that the graphical leap in 2013 left a lot to be desired is all. And we probably could have held out for a while longer given the fact that most games were released for both generations for a few more years. As hard as the Wii U botched things, Nintendo doesn't get enough credit for realizing that graphics and gaming reached the everything looks fine milestone in the 7th generation. I mean, they certainly didn't reach it with the Wii, and graphically, Nintendo absolutely needed an upgrade at the time for sure. But all I'm saying is that they only really needed to catch up to the standard generation and not necessarily top the PS4 or Xbox One. I think they were right to try to offer something different besides shadows that look like 8% better than they did on the PS3 and Xbox 360. They were just dinguses for thinking the answer was the Wii U gamepad. But on a side note though, the Wii Remote and Wii U gamepad did make a pretty good combo for Pikmin 3, so, you know, there is that. At least for my calcium deficient ass anyway. If the PS4 and Xbox One really were significant upgrades, then they wouldn't have both felt the need to release slightly more powerful models only a few years into their life cycles. And come to think of it, that's another pointless thing about the 8th generation, because there aren't even any games that fully utilize the upgraded models. I'm not saying there should have been any exclusives to take advantage of the upgraded hardware, though, because the install base for those games would have been significantly lower, and it would have just been a waste of time and money for the developers. And even beyond that, forcing people to upgrade mid-generation just so they could play all the new games wouldn't be any different from just releasing the PS5 anyway. Kinda like how Nintendo gave the Wii U and Sega Saturn owners the middle finger by releasing the Switch and Dreamcast as early as they did. All I'm saying is that the upgrades are pointless, and if Sony and Microsoft felt that their consoles were underpowered only a couple years after the 8th generation hardware came out, then maybe they should have held off on it a little longer in the first place. Like I said, graphics reached the everything looks fine milestone in the 7th generation, so of course huge noticeable leaps in graphics were going to take longer than ever before. But since every console generation prior was always about 5 to 7-ish years or so, Sony, Microsoft, and honestly everybody at the time felt like it was about time for new hardware. And since Sony and Microsoft were competing with each other, it made sense that neither wanted to let the other get the head start on the 8th generation. Sure, the games would have all been the same in terms of quality, but if the PS3 tried competing with the Xbox One for a few years before the PS4 came out, then it would have definitely gotten crushed just based on the perception that it was obsolete. After all, perception is reality. Sure, the PS4 would have been stronger with all that extra time, and there is a chance it would have ultimately made Sony more money in that alternate universe, but letting the Xbox One run wild for a few years would have been risky as all hell. So I don't blame either company for putting their consoles out when they did. I'm just saying that ideally, the 8th generation would have waited until around the time the PS4 Pro and Xbox One came out. And of all the games that came out during that time period really did need the graphical boost, and they could have came out with a PS3 Pro or Xbox 360X or something like that to hold everyone over. I mean, it'd have been better than jumping straight into the next generation simply because all the other generations made the jump around the same time. In the end, though, the PS4 and Xbox One both sold out the ass anyway, so it really doesn't matter what I find ideal. It's just that what we got kind of felt like the 7.5th generation instead of the 8th. If you ask me, the Switch wasn't early for the 9th generation, Microsoft and Sony were just late to the 8th. At the end of the day, I'm really not complaining though, because while I do feel like the graphical leap wasn't all that great, it was still slightly noticeable, and I certainly enjoyed my time with the PS4. So I'm not saying the 8th console generation was pointless, I'm just saying it was the most pointless. But anyway, what do you think though? Was the 8th console generation the most pointless, or did all the small things make a big difference for you? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, two people who wouldn't be pointless if there were consoles are today's patrons of the day, Dojin Shinji and Alejandro Tamez. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes in the mail and other wacky rewards. And if you want to make a cameo, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch like these legendary human beings you see before you. As always, like and share this video anywhere on the internet to help this channel grow. And if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go ahead and press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's CameronAllOneWord, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.